I'm Ali Abunimah here with my colleague Nora Barrows-Friedman. This week, the Associated Press reported rather matter-of-factly, quote, that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is examining a plan to seal off humanitarian aid to northern Gaza in an attempt to starve out Hamas militants, a plan that, if implemented, could trap without food or water hundreds of thousands of Palestinians unwilling or unable to leave their homes, end quote. Any Palestinian remaining in northern Gaza, a large area including Gaza City, would be considered combatants, meaning military regulations would allow troops to kill them, and denied food, water, medicine, and fuel, according to a copy of the plan seen by the Associated Press. But that intensified genocide by starvation is already well underway. On Saturday, the United Nations World Food Programme said that no food aid has entered northern Gaza since October 1st. Quote, food distribution points as well as kitchens and bakeries in North Gaza have been forced to shut down due to airstrikes, military ground operations, and evacuation orders. The only functioning bakery in North Gaza, supported by WFP, caught fire after being hit by an explosive munition, the UN agency said. The World Food Programme says it has only been able to bring in about 4% of the food needed to sustain over 1 million people in Gaza this month. People have run out of ways to cope, food systems have collapsed, and the risk of famine is real, Antoine Renard, the WFP's country director for Palestine, said. Due to the Israeli decision to bar any humanitarian aid or goods from reaching northern Gaza for the past several weeks, more than 400,000 Palestinians in northern Wadi Gaza could be starved to death, Euromed Monitor said on Monday. About 200,000 Palestinians in the northern Gaza governorate have been without food or drinking water for 10 full days now, the human rights group added. In southern and central Gaza, the situation is also at a breaking point due to insecurity surrounding the crossing points, the World Food Programme says. There are no food distributions, and bakeries are struggling to secure wheat flour, which puts them at risk of shutting down any day. A few hot meal kitchens are still providing one meal for those fortunate enough to access them. As winter approaches, Gazans find themselves without adequate shelter, no fuel, and very little aid, the UN agency added. Although the situation is worsening each and every day, deliberate starvation of the population in Gaza has been Israel's openly stated policy since the first day of this genocide just over 1 year ago. Joining us now to discuss this and other developments in Gaza is Laila Al-Arian, an Emmy and Peabody Award-winning journalist. Laila is the executive producer of Fault Lines, Al Jazeera's flagship investigative documentary series, and she was also the executive producer of a recent episode titled Starving Gaza. You can watch it in full on YouTube as well as on Al Jazeera's website. It highlights not just Israel's deliberate policy of starvation, but also the knowing role of the United States in facilitating and covering up Israel's use of starvation as a weapon. Regular viewers of this live stream will recall that Laila Al-Arian joined us in June to talk about The Night Won't End, the film she produced documenting some of Israel's horrific war crimes in Gaza, including the killing of 6-year-old Hind Rajab. Laila, we're so pleased to welcome you back to the Electronic Intifada live stream.
I'm honored to be back. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Laila.
Hi.
Laila, your previous film, The Night Won't End, was difficult but necessary viewing, and the same can be said about Starving Gaza. In part, the film, which was shot in June, documents the work of Dr. Ahmed Nasser, a young pediatrician at Kamal Adwan Hospital in northern Gaza, and his efforts to save the lives of the youngest and most vulnerable victims of the Israeli starvation policy. Let's watch this excerpt together and then ask you to talk about it. I'll just note that some of this is in Arabic with English subtitles, but I'll summarize it afterwards for those who are listening in.
إشي صعب علينا إنه كيف فقدنا الولد بسبب جوع صعبة.
When famine starts, it takes the youngest first. It's been 5 months since Hanan Assaf and her husband Mohammed buried their 2-year-old son, Khalid. This is Khalid in happier times, before the war on Gaza and the starvation that followed.
هذه الحرب دمرت كل إشي، بيوت، البني آدمين، الشجر، الحجر، كله تدمر. هذه غرفة ابني الصغير، حرقوا لنا إياه الاحتلال، ما خلونا ذكرى لا أي حاجة. الولد ما كان فيه ولا أي حاجة للأمانة يعني. فجأة الولد بدأ يزن، أكله خف لأنه مش موجود الأكل. كان هو متعود على اللبن، رز، فواكه ياكل الولد، وهذا طبعاً من بداية الحرب بدأ يخف شوية 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 لحد درجة إنه انقطع نهائياً. ما كان في شيء موجود أبداً إلا الخبازة، ما فيش شيء في السوق، والأسعار خيالية.
And in that clip, for those who are listening, we hear Hanan Assaf talking about how this war has destroyed everything, houses, people, trees. She shows us the burnt out room of her son. And she says Khaled, the little toddler who we see playing in videos taken in previous times, had been completely healthy before the war. And she talks about his decline as food completely ran out. The film, I'll say, also documents other very difficult stories, including that of a 5-month-old baby called Abdurrahim, who died during filming. Laila, please tell us about some of the families and children that you and your colleagues came to know through this film and what it means to tell these very difficult stories.
Thank you so much for having me on again. Well, I think currently at least at the time that we were editing and putting together this film, there's an estimate that 38 people had died of starvation in Gaza. All but one were children. I'm certain this is an undercount. I think far more people have died of starvation than was documented because some people are dying of starvation in their homes, so it's not officially registered with Gaza's health ministry or health department. So this is one of my concerns, is we don't actually know the full picture of how many people have died of starvation. When I was looking at some lists of names, for example, Khalid Assaf, the 2-year-old you just talked about, wasn't on there. So I am very concerned that we don't have the full picture. What we do know is that there is a full-blown famine in Gaza, according to the United Nations. This, I believe, has received relatively little coverage in the media at large because of a larger problem we have with the horrors of Gaza being undercovered. But in the case of Abdulaziz Al-Hurani, who you mentioned, the 5-month-old who died while we were filming, his mother was pregnant with him as Israel's onslaught on Gaza began. She describes to our team, and we couldn't unfortunately fit this into the film, but just how horrible the circumstances were during her pregnancy. She was drinking contaminated water. She had no food to eat, not even bread, for very long stretches of time. She was eating these wild greens that Khalid's mom, Hanan Assaf, talked about, called khubeza. This is like a wild green that grows in Gaza that's not really a food, doesn't have the nutritional value that people need. And that's what she was eating. She was, like I said, sleeping very uncomfortably, displaced constantly under bombardment. She was also talks about breathing very contaminated air. And she says to us, she said, if I'm struggling this much, what about my baby? So I think, I'm not a doctor, but I think probably Abdulaziz's health problems go back to his mother's pregnancy and not getting enough nutrients, in utero. And then after he's born, his mother struggles to nurse him because she's malnourished, which is a very common case that we hear about. And the doctor, incredible doctor, Ahmed Hashim, 28 years old. Sorry, Ahmed Hashim Abu Nasser, 28 years old, 2 years out of medical school. He's had to quickly become an expert in malnutrition. He's had to deal with hundreds of cases. The hospital staff are significantly under-resourced. They don't have, as he talks about a lot, the capabilities or the tools that they need to treat a lot of these cases. So what they knew about Abdulaziz is that he had chronic diarrhea. He wasn't able to hold anything down. They believed he may have had a dairy allergy, but there was a shortage of soy milk and plant-based milk in Gaza, and there was a shortage even of formula, as his mom talks about. So this is the direct result of Israel's, stated and open war of starvation on Gaza.
Yeah, and I apologize for misstating his name. It's Abdulaziz, and he's a beautiful baby, and it's really shocking in the film that at one point the doctors successfully revive him after his heart stops, but then we learn that very sadly just a couple of days later he passed away, and his is just one of many cases of really the weakest and most vulnerable people being targeted by this genocide whose stories are told.
Yeah. And I should mention his mom and dad did not want to talk to our camera crew. I should mention many of the people who filmed for us in Gaza were the most talented, beautiful cameramen I think our team has ever worked with. They're just their talent under the most horrifying circumstances is really impressive. But they could not get the family, and not that they pressured them or anything, but the family, understandably, Abdulaziz's parents did not want to continue filming or speak or anything after their son tragically passed away. And that's understandable. I think a lot of people in Gaza, even though I've never seen a more open people to media coverage, I think there's a sense of almost like moral duty and obligation in Palestinians to tell their stories under the most horrific circumstances. I think people are also starting to question, why should we tell our stories? Nothing is changing. The world sees our pain and our suffering, and they're continuing the starvation policy. They're continuing their horrifying onslaughts and bombardments, sniping children, all of the atrocities that we see daily. So why should we keep talking? And I can't blame them, frankly.
No, absolutely. It's entirely understandable. You mentioned the policies that Israel has very openly stated that it would carry out from the very, I mean, it was like October 9th, I believe, of last year, when Yoav Gallant said that that Israel was going to cut off all the food, water, electricity, et cetera, et cetera. And it's followed through, obviously, by deliberately delaying and blocking humanitarian aid from entering Gaza. The film also documents Israel's systematic pattern of bombing aid distribution sites. But a key point made in Starving Gaza is that the Joe Biden, Kamala Harris administration has known that Israel is deliberately blocking food from getting in, but is actively covering it up. Let's watch another clip. This is reporter Hind Hassan talking to Stacey Gilbert, who resigned from the U.S. State Department in May over the Biden administration's role in the genocide and specifically the destruction of aid or the blocking of aid.
Famine is not a foregone conclusion in a conflict. Famine happens when assistance is blocked. It is the outcome of a deliberate decision.
In April, Stacey Gilbert was asked for her input on a Biden administration report on whether Israel was committing war crimes in Gaza.
I was shocked to see that it said in very clear terms, it is our determination that Israel is not blocking humanitarian assistance.
You had advised that that wasn't the case. Is that correct?
Yes. The subject matter experts were removed, and the report was moved up to a higher level. We were told you will see the report when it is released publicly.
And then the report comes out and just doesn't include what you had to say?
I wasn't sure I read that correctly. I read it again, and I sent an email then that I would resign as a result of that.
Do you remember what you wrote in your resignation email?
I said that report will haunt us. And it does, and it haunts me.
Laila, tell us more about what we learned from Gilbert and what we know about the Biden administration's role in aiding and abetting the starvation of Gaza.
Sure. Well, part of this goes back to what's known as the National Security Memorandum. So, this was an effort by some members of Congress who were concerned about the humanitarian situation in Gaza to basically force the Biden administration to review two things: whether Israel was violating international law with U.S. weapons, and whether Israel was blocking humanitarian assistance. In the process of doing this study to figure this all out, people like Stacey Gilbert, like others, were talking to partners on the ground, humanitarian organizations, some of which the U.S. actually funds and works with directly to find out the situation. And it was unequivocal that Israel, and factual, and that Israel was blocking and continues to block humanitarian assistance. She made that recommendation. There was another memo by USAID, another agency, that also came to that conclusion. And there's actually a really interesting and informative article in ProPublica that really goes through this in great detail. And despite these facts, it was a policy decision to support Israel no matter what, and to deny the facts. So, and what's really interesting is key in all of this is Jack Lew, the U.S. ambassador to Israel, who overrode factual findings to give his opinion that Netanyahu and his government can be trusted to facilitate aid. So he seems to be a really key person in all of this. And you know, Stacey says very clearly, this decision was made at the highest levels. It's a policy decision. They're changing the facts on the ground. And she said for herself, she wanted to be an asterisk on the report saying that the determination that Israel is not blocking humanitarian assistance is patently, demonstrably false. So she took the decision to resign because of it's a moral stance. She said, I couldn't continue anymore when I knew that this was a lie.
And she had been at the State Department for 20 years before she resigned. And of course, the point she makes is that the reason they decided to change the facts is because if the US government determined officially that Israel is blocking humanitarian aid, then by US law, the United States cannot send weapons to Israel. But they were so determined to keep sending the weapons, to keep carrying out this genocide, that they're ready to falsify the facts in order to keep the weapons going. And that means that they're both ensure that people are dying by bombs and bullets and dying by starvation at the same time. It's really unbelievable. But Laila, with Stacey Gilbert's words in mind, I want to refer to a story that broke yesterday. You may have seen this. The Washington Post reported that the Biden administration intensified pressure on Israel this week to improve dire humanitarian conditions in the Gaza Strip, warning that the United States would be forced to undertake new actions, including a potential suspension of military assistance if food and other aid to Palestinians is not increased within a month, end quote. That's what the Washington Post says. That ultimatum was put forward in a letter from the Biden administration to the Israeli government, and both Israeli and US officials have confirmed this. I also want to draw your attention to this tweet from Vice President Kamala Harris, in which she writes, quote, "The UN reports that no food has entered northern Gaza in nearly 2 weeks. Israel must urgently do more to facilitate the flow of aid to those in need," end quote. And there have also been apparently coordinated tweets and statements from other prominent Democrats, including so-called progressives Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ilhan Omar, suddenly expressing renewed concern about the situation in Gaza after downplaying it or ignoring it or claiming that they were working tirelessly for a ceasefire for the past few months. So my questions, Why do Joe Biden and Kamala Harris need to give Israel another 30 days to starve people in Gaza after bombing and starving them for a whole year? Is it just a coincidence that this is happening as the polls show that the US election race is tightening, particularly in some of the key swing states? Is it a coincidence that the supposed 30-day ultimatum for Israel to act conveniently ends after Election Day in the United States? And is there anything legally or procedurally that prevents the Biden-Harris administration from acting right now to force Israel to end the starvation and stop the genocide?
Those are all good questions. You're not the only one to raise them. I think there's a lot of skepticism now. We've heard about Rafah being the red line. Of course, that proved to be false. There clearly are no red lines when it comes to this administration in Israel. We've seen Israel pretty much act in an unfettered, uncontained way. And it's only getting worse, as Abu Bakr very eloquently and very powerfully demonstrated. This is a new phase of the genocide. The absolute horrors happening in northern Gaza just in the last week, in Jabalia camp especially. We heard just a couple of days ago the story of the Al Sayed family, who actually have a relative here in Virginia, where I live, which a family that was in their home in Jabalia camp, attacked, many of their members killed and others injured. They called for help. Al Jazeera's journalist Anas al-Sharif actually played that recording, posted it on social media, where they're desperately asking for help, for treatment for the injured. A doctor was sent over to help them. He too was killed. This is yet another example of Israel attacking people, rescue workers, medical workers, doctors who respond to cries basically for help and to be rescued and treated. This is just one example of many. I mean, northern Gaza, Jabalia camp, of course, this extends to all of Gaza. We also saw the horrific attack a couple of days ago on 5 children playing in the Al-Shatti camp, the same day that 4 Israeli soldiers were killed at their military base. But of course, the media coverage covers the killing of the 4 soldiers, but not the 5 children.
As teenagers,
As
4 Israeli teenagers killed.
Right. So we see a complete media blackout of what's happening, and that actually serves to help the Biden-Harris administration when these horrors are not documented, not covered, they're buried, or there's a total blackout. I mean, I've been obsessively checking the mainstream legacy media to see if they're covering anything on what's happening in the North. And like I said, it's a complete blackout. You have to scroll and scroll and scroll if you see anything at all. Even the fire, which was like they kind of were forced to cover because it was all over social media, was very much buried. It was difficult to find news of that. So I think we see an intensification of the attacks all over Gaza, but especially in the north. And with that, we see a lack of media coverage.
And yeah, just kind of following up on that, the in your opinion, like why is the Biden administration, saying that that Israel has 30 days to, open the crossings and let the humanitarian aid in? Why couldn't they do it now? Like, what do you think is behind this very calculated media strategy by the White
I
House?
find it interesting that the first person to release that was Barak Ravid, who, former IDF, I think he's still a reservist, actually. IDF reservist, works for Axios, is very pro-Israel. I think I'm one of probably many Palestinians who he's blocked.
I'm blocked.
You're blocked?
Ravid, yeah.
I think if you look at his block list, it's probably 90% Palestinians. But, and it's ridiculous to block people for simply asking you to do your job and not be a stenographer for the Israeli military and government. But I do think it seems like a strategic leak. I'm always, very interested to see when he's the first to kind of break something, because that usually means it's being leaked by the Israeli military or US government or the White House. I don't know why. I think it feels like a PR move because people are dying now. This is nothing new. Stacey Gilbert and her team found that Israel was blocking humanitarian assistance back in April. It's now October. This is nothing new. People are dying now. And not only that, this famine, this starvation is going to have long-term effects. So I was speaking yesterday with Alex Smith, who resigned from USAID over Israel's starvation policy a few months ago. And he was telling me, as an expert on maternal and child health, that even if they were to resume aid tomorrow, he said, it doesn't work like that. People are going to feel the effects of starvation for the rest of their lives. These children are going to feel it for the rest of their lives. And that's what people have to understand. It's already too late. So even if you resume the aid, even if they start to have the same amount of food they had before, it's going to be a very long process.
I just want to say, I mean, you said this feels like a coordinated campaign, and I believe that's what we're seeing. And I think that it started with, there was that tweet from Kamala Harris suddenly drawing attention to the hunger in northern Gaza, as if the rest of Gaza isn't in the most dire circumstances. So they try to sort of, they only raise northern Gaza because they also don't want to talk about the extent of the Israel-made, U.S. Israel-made crisis else throughout Gaza. But then we did see these tweets from, as I mentioned, from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ilhan Omar, and they were very on message. I mean, they all used very similar language. They called for an arms embargo. They only called on Biden, who conveniently is not running. They don't mention Kamala Harris and her responsibility and her ability to speak out if she wanted to, and to say, this will be my policy as president. She hasn't done anything different from Biden. And then we saw this leaked story in the Washington Post and coming from Axios, as you mentioned, saying, oh, the Biden administration is threatening, if not a full arms embargo, but to withhold arms if Israel doesn't do something within 30 days, which then makes it look as if, oh, the progressives made a demand and the Biden administration is following through. And I think this is all coordinated to try to buy people off, whether it's the gullible or those who are desperate for anything at all, to say, look, they're finally doing something. We can go to the polls and vote for them on November 5th, or people are voting now. Early voting has opened in many states. And to say, and we have to vote for them because if they're defeated, then they won't be able to follow through. I think it's very, very cynical. And that's just my, I'm editorializing because I don't want to put words in your mouth, Laila, but I feel like these things need to be said.
Just from what I've heard from voters, Arab voters, Muslim voters, young voters, people just generally horrified by the genocide in Gaza, is that it's too little too late. This has been going on for a year. It's horrifying. I mean, people are seeing people burning alive in Gaza on their phones. They're hearing about people starving to death. They're hearing about children being sniped in the head and the chest. Every single day, there's ongoing horrors. So this move is toothless. There's nothing behind it. We've seen this movie before a lot. We've heard this rhetoric before, and we haven't seen any action behind it. In fact, a lot of what I'm hearing from Harris is warmongering. I mean, she gave that interview with 60 Minutes where she said Iran is the biggest enemy of the US, and kind of suggesting that she would even support kind of all options on the table against Iran. She's given her unconditional support to Israel, and whatever crumbs she's now offering to voters, I think it is an indication they're worried about Michigan. As you mentioned, the race is tightening, the polls are tightening. It's not looking good for Michigan. And if the election comes down to Michigan and people are upset, and Michigan has the largest Lebanese American community, so now Israel's onslaughts and bombardments have spread to Lebanon. I don't think this is going to be enough, personally, from what I've heard from voters in terms of swaying them. Maybe people who, there's this group Engage, which purports to speak for Muslim Americans, which has endorsed Harris, and there's other voices kind of saying that Trump is going to be worse for Palestinians, but I just think people have seen too much, they've heard too much to kind of from my conversations that I've had.
I wanted to switch a little bit, kind of go back to some media criticism analysis. Israel obviously doesn't allow journalists into Gaza from the outside. So to make starving Gaza, as you said, you had to rely on Palestinian journalists inside Gaza. And indeed, we've all relied on them to be our eyes and our ears for more than a year. Our colleagues in Gaza are paying a terrible price. To date, 177 Palestinian journalists have been killed, according to the government media office in Gaza. And many, if not most cases, in many of, if not most cases, Israel has deliberately targeted them. Just this past week, as Israel attacked Jabalia refugee camp in northern Gaza, its forces killed Mohammed Al-Tanani, a cameraman for Al-Aqsa TV, and injured his colleague Tamer Labad. Fadi Al-Wahidi, a cameraman for Al Jazeera Arabic, was shot in the neck and is now permanently paralyzed. Can you talk about the situation of our colleagues in Gaza and the reactions or lack of them by global establishment media? Are we seeing the type of solidarity there needs to be with these incredibly courageous journalists in Gaza?
It's been a horrifying time. Israel has already broken all manner of record in terms of the killing of journalists, not to mention children, humanitarian workers, UN workers, but certainly journalists. And that simply doesn't resonate, or doesn't seem to resonate with my journalistic colleagues, especially in the United States and Europe and elsewhere. Over 4 days, the Israeli military killed 2 journalists and injured at least 3. It started, I think, with the killing of 19-year-old Hassan Hamad in his home in an airstrike. And then, as you mentioned, Al Jazeera cameraman Fadi, and another cameraman, also Ali Al-Attar, who was shot, and he has shrapnel lodged in his brain. So I believe Ali, Fadi, and Tamer are all in critical condition and need urgent medical evacuation. This should be a no-brainer. I mean, this is like the lowest of the low-hanging fruit in terms of issues for journalists to say, okay, even if I'm worried, I'm not going to be able to report on this issue because I'll be seen as biased. Even if I'm afraid of my editor, just to say, don't attack journalists while doing their jobs. That should be a no-brainer. Not when it comes to Palestinian journalists. Their silence is deafening. We will never forget their silence, because this is a huge betrayal of their colleagues who are putting their lives on the line to do their jobs in the most heroic and, I haven't seen journalists with their level of professionalism and heroism that I have of these journalists in Gaza. It feels like Al Jazeera is particularly being targeted. At least that's what Hussam Shabat, who's a journalist, told my former colleague Kavitha Shakuru when she was reporting for The Intercept on this issue, that it feels like Al Jazeera is particularly being targeted. But we know that, you mentioned Al-Aqsa TV, we know that they've killed more than 175 journalists, many of them not working for Al Jazeera. So it's really horrifying. The silence is shameful, and it continues. And I think it all goes back to this notion of that Israel's counting on in their PR war, which is there are no civilians in Gaza. This toddler is not a civilian. This journalist is not a civilian, and it's just this deep dehumanization that extends to every single Palestinian, so that we could see them burning alive, and there's just silence in response.
And Laila, there's also this idea, frankly, racist idea that goes back, as long as I've been doing this work, and I started by doing media criticism in the 1990s, that Palestinians are not reliable reporters on their own lives and their own situation. And this doesn't really apply to anyone else. You can see, for example, Asian American or Chinese American journalists who are employed to report on China or Chinese American issues, You can see reporters of other ethnic backgrounds being allowed to report on their communities or their countries of origin or their countries that they're citizens of. This is normal. You see this across the New York Times or the Washington Post. You see it a little bit more now with Palestinians, perhaps because they have no choice. Of course, it's the norm for Israel, when it comes to the New York Times, for example. Their bureau chiefs are almost always Jewish Americans, if not Israeli Americans, at least in the case, for example, of Etan Bronner. His son was serving, this was a few years ago, his son was serving in the Israeli army while he was reporting on the Israeli army. I mean, a massive conflict of interest. Of course, I don't associate being Jewish American necessarily with being pro-Israel. It just has been the case with New York Times reporters and bureau chiefs. In general, there have been some exceptions. I have to cast my mind back to Deborah Sontag during the Second Intifada, who was a brilliant reporter. So, I don't mean to make generalizations, but of course it would be very difficult to imagine the New York Times appointing a Palestinian American or a Muslim American as its Jerusalem bureau chief. I think it would be almost impossible. This is all a long preamble to say that even in this context where Palestinians are not trusted or not considered reliable narrators of their own reality, all of these international media organizations have still relied on Palestinian so-called stringers and photographers to be the eyes and ears on the ground. So at the same time, they don't trust Palestinians, but they rely on them. And then when they're being targeted and murdered, they're not there for them. Where are the international campaigns like there are for, when an American Wall Street Journal journalist gets arrested in Russia for snooping around a military base or a weapons factory? Where even is the solidarity for the Gray Zones journalist Jeremy Lafredo, who was arrested and detained by the Israeli military and accused of something similar? Of course, I don't want to make direct comparisons of the facts, which I may not be fully in hold of. But when Evan Gershkovich of the Wall Street Journal was snooping around sensitive Russian sites, there's this huge international media campaign saying, oh, he was just doing his job reporting. And of course, the United States would never mind if a journalist from Russia Today was snooping around U.S. Military bases or weapons factories. That would just be perfectly normal reporting. That's in one case. Then on the other case, we have this silence. I don't even know if there's a question there, Laila, but I'm just going to put that all to you.
I can tell you this. In legacy newsrooms, you will see signs, I stand with Evan. You will see signs about Austin Tice. You won't see Shireen Abu Akleh. And you won't see the 176 journalists killed. And Shireen, let's say the 176 journalists are not US citizens. We don't care about them. Shireen was a US citizen, but I think we should care about everybody. But I mean, it's shameful. And I think it just simply goes back to the deep dehumanization of Palestinians. I think Aaron David Miller was very honest with the New Yorker when he was asked about whether Joe Biden feels any sympathy or empathy for Palestinians. And he said, no, I don't think he actually does. He just doesn't have that depth of concern. He doesn't have that empathy. And I think that applies largely to many people in these newsrooms who are making these decisions, who are shaping the coverage. Not everybody. There's people who are really trying to do good work, who are pushing their newsrooms to do better. But I think I would say overall, that this dehumanization extends all over, even to their own media colleagues, even to people wearing press vests, even to people sniped while they're doing their job, or killed or bombed in their own houses after receiving, Hassan Hamad, 19 years old, was receiving threats from the Israeli military leading up to his killing. So I think it just goes back to that. It just this dehumanization. I mean, if there's no depth of feeling for children being sniped, I think it's not surprising, sadly and tragically, that they don't have a depth of feeling for journalists being killed while doing their jobs.
Yeah. Well, finally, Laila, is there anything else you think that we should be paying particular attention to more than 1 year into this genocide? What are your thoughts on how we can keep going as journalists, as activists, as parents, as people who care? How are we supposed to keep doing this work?
It's very difficult. I know so many people who are burnt out, who are deeply grieving, even people who aren't Palestinian, who are human, who see the humanity in Palestinians or of Palestinians. I would just say, please don't look away, even if it's difficult. And I know it's difficult. And I'm sure your audience watching this are not looking away. But please encourage others, to continue bearing witness in whichever way you can. I know it's difficult. I know it's traumatic. I know there's like secondhand trauma and all of that. But even if it's just reading articles, don't only depend on the legacy media, because as I said, there's a lot of stories not being told. So please follow the Palestinian journalists on social media. Please, the people of Gaza feel forgotten and they feel abandoned. And it's up to us to make sure they're not forgotten and they're not abandoned. And another thing that I think about a lot is I'm worried that we're all going to move on after all of this. And it's up to us to ensure that the world doesn't move on, that we keep these stories alive, that we keep talking about Gaza, what's happening there, the people who've been killed, that we humanize them, we tell their stories, and we just keep all of these, we keep basically we document Israel's crimes that are taking place every single day.
And Laila, you and your team are doing that. As I mentioned in June, we had you on to speak about The Night Won't End, which is an extraordinary film, an extraordinarily difficult to watch film, but a very necessary film. And I would just want to remind viewers that there's nothing out of date about that film. That film remains a tremendously important and current document. So if you haven't seen it, search for The Night Won't End, which is one of the episodes of Fault Lines, the Al Jazeera documentary series of which our guest Laila Al-Arian is executive producer. Share it, watch it, share it with people. These episodes are very powerful, and they do so much in a relatively short time. So people can take them and watch them and share them. And of course, they should do the same with Starving Gaza, which is the recent episode of Fault Lines that we've been talking about today. And again, these are extraordinary pieces of journalism that live the values that you talk about, Laila, because you are working directly with journalists in Gaza who are the ones on the front line risking their lives to tell these stories and bear witness to these utter horrors that are being done in our name and with our money, and with such cruelty and callousness. So I just want to say on behalf of all of us, Laila, thank you for the work that you and your colleagues are doing. We pray that you will continue to have the strength to do this work, that we will all continue to have the strength to do it, and that we'll do it for as long as we need to.
Thank you so much. Thank you all.
Thanks so much, Laila.